So land reclamation is something, for those of you that know me, I could talk about a long, long time. But Vic needs a few more minutes here on this podium, so I'll make it brief. And what I want to point out here, two things. First of all, Alberta is well renowned worldwide for its technological advances, its good reclamation techniques, and it's also known very well for its regulatory framework. So we're doing pretty good in Alberta, and we were some of the pioneers. If you read the new book that just came out, The History of Reclamation in Alberta, you can be very proud of where we've been and what we've done. But we do have a lot of things that we've put on the back burner for a considerable period of time. And I think now, as we're looking at sustainable land use, it might be an appropriate time to pull some of those things off the back burner. We've talked about reclaiming to equivalent capability for a long time. And that's become our gold standard, what we aim to achieve. But we need to think a little bit more about maybe what we decided we were going to do at the beginning of a coal mine or other industrial disturbance is not so much what we need today. We don't need to go back to what was there, and maybe we need to look at novel ecosystems, some other approach other than equivalent capability. Now that's a scary road to go down, and we've worked so hard to get on the road we're on. Maybe we don't want to be going there. Digging and dumping. Why are we digging and dumping? You hear me say this a lot, but why are we digging and dumping? It's 2016, we can remediate pretty much any contaminant in soil and water. But we don't do it because it costs a lot of money. We don't do it because we don't have regulations that say we have to do it. So move down a bit and look at the use of waste material. So similarly, we have tons, literally tons of waste material that would be good and appropriate to use in reclamation. But we don't use a lot of them because we're concerned about the risks, and we don't know where that stepping point is that we can say we understand enough about using these materials that it's time to start using them rather than filling the landfills. Why are we not reclaiming old contaminated sites? And why is there such a long period of time for reclaiming many of our disturbances? Well, again, it costs money, and we don't necessarily have the regulations that are pushing it. Progressive reclamation and small footprints. We've talked about that for decades and the importance of it. And we're making good strides in it, but still, there's a lot we're not doing because of the cost, because of the regulations. So I want to leave these things with you and let us think about how we can step out of the way we're looking at things right now, sort of the status quo, and how we can challenge ourselves to maybe be making better use of these materials and moving forward again in the province so that we're leading, not following somebody else making those changes.
So we talked a lot about challenges to food production and energy and climate change, but of course we want other things. We want a natural environment that we enjoy. We want biodiversity and its benefits. Now, there are lots of different mentions of biodiversity, but one that resonates with the public is species at risk. And I just use that as an indicator here. We can see where the trend lines are going in terms of species at risk in the country. We're still challenged in a number of fronts. We can bring that back closer to Alberta. One of my favorites, boreal caribou, is really the poster child in some ways around species at risk and the challenges that we face largely with energy and forestry activity and land use in the boreal. I have my standing joke that I didn't have gray hair before I started working on boreal caribou. This is such a vexing problem. We can see in the red here that those are the not likely to be self-sustaining herds of caribou. We look at the growth rates that we see across the province, and almost all of the herds, they're significantly below 1. So in a sense, we've dug ourselves into a hole. There are ways out. There are ways out that we'll have to invest in, and they will take 30, 50, 70 years, depending on how we invest in this particular challenge. But again, can we get ahead of the game in some ways on biodiversity challenges, on species at risk issues? And it's not just in the north and in the boreal or in the regions that we perhaps don't have the density. And this is a bit of an older chart, but we can see that in terms of numbers of species at risk, the hotspots are really in the white zone and in the southern portions of the province. So we've got to think carefully about the scope and investment in different species at risk and different biodiversity problems, and how we attack those issues that are not as directly focused on food and fiber and energy production. So we're going to switch gears now, and this is the part where we stick our necks out a little bit. And we're going to suggest a few things that we might think of as ways to do things a bit differently, ways to avoid some of the challenges, perhaps address some of the opportunities. So we have a list of about 6 or 8 things that maybe we can have some of the discussion or conversation over. What might we do differently? Some of them are a bit abstract, some of them are a bit concrete. First one is measure. Measure better. This is a set of images from something called the Inclusive Wealth Index. This is a measure of natural capital and other forms of capital. I'd say over the last 10 years, we've gotten much better at thinking about what natural capital really means and how we actually measure it. Now, this particular slide, it's a little tough to see on the colors on the screen, but shows that at least in these limited measures of natural capital, we have been depreciating our natural capital as a country. We've been substituting into other forms of capital, social capital, human capital, produced capital. So overall, we're doing fairly well. But we have to start thinking about at what point we worry about those pieces of substitution of natural capital into others, and how well are we measuring those forms of natural capital. This is largely energy, agricultural, forestry capital. Are we capturing some of these biodiversity pieces of natural capital? So measuring better is one piece of it. Anne mentioned things like the loss of agricultural land to developed area. It's actually surprising to me that we don't have great measures of things like that. We've been investing heavily in trying to get better assessments. This is a snapshot of land use changes in the province over about a decade or so, 15-year period. And we have seen tremendous loss of agricultural land to developed areas. In the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, we've seen something on the order of 0.5% per year, much smaller province-wide. But actually, some of the biggest land use changes in the white zone in the province are conversion of pasture land to cropland, much bigger, orders of magnitude bigger than changes of agriculture to developed land. So there will be implications of that on ecosystem services, on a whole host of other types of outcomes. Better measurement will help us get a better sense of what we're actually seeing changing, what's changing in the capital stock, where perhaps we need that canary in the coal mine. I think there are tremendous opportunities coming at us in terms of precision agriculture, the data from it, the data from drones, the data from very small scale, fine scale measurements. There are discussions, interesting discussions about who actually owns those data. But if we can start to use that in actually assessing what's the stock of capital within agriculture, are we depreciating or appreciating that stock? And one of my favorite ones is actually the use of data from humans. These are data from people and fishing activity as captured by their iPhones. Now, don't immediately switch off your iPhone worrying about whether people know you're in Banff or not. But this is, of course, a new way of data collection that's not relying on surveys or internet polls, but actually just tracking what people do. How do they enjoy the land? How are they affected by changes in land use? We're now seeing this in transportation, in bird watching, in recreational activities, and a host of other activities. This will give us a much better sense of how people interact with the land, of how we benefit from land use changes or are harmed by adverse land use changes. So I think this is step one, is measuring better use of big data. I think our second one is constructing clever regulations, or we've called them innovative regulations. This is a little box that economists talk about. This is something that characterizes the Porter hypothesis. Big debate in our literature about this. But really one of the premises is that you might be able to define a regulatory structure that achieves, in this case, your environmental outcome and stimulates technology and actually generates better economic outcomes, better wealth outcomes for the industry. So can we design those types of flexible regulations that would lead to innovation as well as the environmental goal or the policy goal that we're seeking? And you'll see it says in parentheses there sometimes under business performance. So that's part of the puzzle. Well, I think in many cases in the province and in the country, we've already started to think about flexible, clever regulations, market-based regulations. Andrew's going to talk about climate policy and the importance of carbon pricing as a mechanism, as a regulatory mechanism. On the land use side, we have invested in thinking about biodiversity offsets. In the land use framework in this province, we have an enabling framework to allow for flexible regulations. The wetlands policy is starting to implement wetlands offsets, in lieu fee mechanisms to start to send those price signals and to send those signals to improve the technology. So that now we'll put some of that regulatory flexibility in to perhaps improve our output and avoid some of the challenges that we've observed. Support innovation and technology. Now, it's always dangerous when you have two academics that are going to come up here and ask for more research money. Well, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. But research or investments in research and innovation are key for productivity growth. And productivity growth is the driver of much of our economic output, our livelihood. Investing in both productivity growth for market goods, agriculture, energy, forestry, as well as for environmental goods. We are somewhere right close to Estonia on the, not that there's any disparaging comments about people from Estonia, but I think we have room to grow on the investments in research side. I mean, if you look at that bottom graph, it's a little small, but we've had significant productivity growth in agriculture over history, largely through investments in innovation. They lag a little bit in some cases. There's a bit of a puzzle about what's going on in Alberta. Why is our growth somewhat smaller? But these are questions that I think we need to think about investments to maintain that innovative edge and that productivity gain. The next one is innovations around how we actually evaluate land use change. How we look forward and say, what are the trade-offs? What choices should we make? We are much better now at using data, at involving interdisciplinary teams, and at modeling land use changes in the future, understanding those trade-offs. This is a little illustration from the UK. The UK about 5 years ago undertook a major ecosystem services assessment for the entire country and decided that every change that they make in a major land use fashion will be assessed in this broad economics, environment, sustainability framework to see how those trade-offs pan out. Significant investment in data collection and in interdisciplinary research has generated really a framework for them to look forward and see how they evaluate those trade-offs and challenges. And I think we have the capability to move in the same directions. This is bringing back to my old friend caribou. This is just a graph that shows in the same way we're modeling some of northern Alberta and saying, well, what would be the projections under different types of land use policies if we model simply maintaining the land base or trying to achieve habitat for caribou? The populations actually continue to decline. So in our trade-off modeling, we've got to start thinking about other mechanisms, restoring seismic lines, investing in predator control, other activities so that we can bring species back. But of course, there are costs and benefits associated with each of those. So thinking about modeling these trade-offs in an interdisciplinary fashion, I think, is one of the keys. This last one's a bit different, and that's trying to help in adaptation and innovation. And we've come back to the food waste issue as an example in this one. For me, this is such a fascinating slide. 30% of food product is wasted essentially across many categories. It varies across households and retail. It varies across food categories, but a significant challenge globally, but also these are Canadian data, so within Canada. What are the regulatory mechanisms? A host of them we could think about, but are there clever ways that we could instill adaptation? At least one example are uses of various communications and app data to try to connect those that are going to have food available for others to use with people who might be able to use it. From retail sector to food banks or to a host of other activities. This is an example from the US. There's one developing in Alberta right now. There's another one developed by a group of students at the U of A for Edmonton. So clever uses of technology and data to help people adapt to a problem that we're facing within the food area.
So we have two other potential options that we can look at for dealing with some of the issues we're facing regarding sustainable land use. And the first one is social license. Social license is a term that we hear all the time. And we sometimes ask ourselves, well, what does this really mean? Well, social license technically means the level of acceptance or approval that a company or a project gets from the public, gets from its stakeholders. And what that also means is that we have, and maybe this is the most important thing, that there actually is a system whereby any of us can provide feedback to meet our demands, to make some major changes that we think are important for environmental health and social outcomes, etc. An example is McDonald's. So McDonald's still serves cheeseburgers and French fries, but they also serve healthy salads. So social license in that context can also be used by a company to shape their image however they want. And so we have to be thinking of how we're using the opportunity of social license and what we really might be able to do appropriately. And there's one more thing regarding social license. So this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I direct your attention to the green line that says trust. And this is just an example of Canadian attitudes towards mining and energy. So social license was really a term that was developed when the mining industry thought it needed to do something to enhance its reputation. And if you look at trust and you look at to your left, there's some pretty high numbers of trust associated with energy, with alternative energy, with farming. But then you go to the other end and you look at other types of energy, and you look at mining, for example, and you can see that the trust that the public, that Canadians have in the mining industry is still very low. So the last thing to look at is a reconnection to nature. There's a tremendous amount of new literature and new studies and money available for grants to do more research in this area. And really what it means is we need to look at how we use the earth differently. The Aboriginal perspective is much more in keeping with a sustainable approach to land use, but it doesn't mean that we need to go back to where we were with hunting and gathering. It just means we need to make wise choices and be aware of the consequences. So it means thinking about the earth in a relationship perspective, rather than what can we get from the land. It's what can we get from the land, but what responsibility do we have to protect the land, to keep the land sustainable? One of the issues that has been raised is that many people have lost that connection to the land. They've grown up in cities, they haven't had the opportunity to really connect, and so they don't really understand about ecosystem services. They get milk from the store and they don't think about the farm that supplied the milk and the land that provided the forage for the cattle to produce that milk. There's a whole science, a new science called eco-psychology. There's a deficit disorder that people are not connecting to nature, and when they're not connecting to nature, they're often losing a sense of belonging. And so that whole area is full of new information and new literature. There's a whole new construct called nature relatedness. And this is really about the idea that the more we are related to nature, the more positive our emotions are going to be towards nature and towards land sustainability, and therefore the more pro-environmental the choices that we make. So we all know third-generation farmers, and their land is basically almost like their kids. I mean, it's so important to them, it's a part of their life. And that's what we're really looking for, is that connectedness. There's a huge number of programs, particularly aimed at youth and young people, that are trying to get them connected to nature, recognizing that nature's in your backyard. You don't have to live on a farm or an acreage to really understand what nature can provide. So that takes us to wrapping up with our key messages. And those key messages, Vic talked about most of them and basically said, yes, we may be sticking our neck out a little bit, but we really believe that these key messages will help us move on a better road to sustainability. So let's just review them. The first one then is to measure or improve the measurement. And improve the measurement would be nice, but there are many things that we really don't even have tangible or quantitative information about. We want, obviously, to be investing in innovation, but perhaps the third bullet is the one we should really focus on, and that is setting clear objectives. What are our targets? And maybe even more importantly than the targets are the triggers that would signal to us that we're moving in a direction that we maybe shouldn't be going. Like, when do we know that we're putting the land in jeopardy? When do we know that it's time to pull back and look at something a little bit different? And the other important one, obviously, is education, because we're not going to be able to move forward unless people are aware of what's new, what we could do differently, how we could look at things in a different way, and how we can use those new measurements and new data in appropriate ways. We talked, Vic and I, a little bit bit about the fact that we really don't have as much extension as we used to. You know, the transfer of information from the scientists, from the practitioners to the public and to the land users. And we suggested that perhaps this is something that the Alberta Institute of Agrologists might be interested in getting more involved in. And then, of course, the experiencing the land and its uses and getting that kind of connectivity to the land again. So if you put this in a pie chart, a very simplistic pie chart, obviously, but you could put all of those key messages into a third of the pie chart. And we can say, we've got data, we can really move forward to make a change, to do things a little bit different, to recognize those triggers and to act on them before we get to a tipping point or a critical point. But really, the two questions left are what to do and who should do it. So I put a green light on what to do because we know what to do. There's a whole bunch of things on the table, and obviously the bigger question is what should the priorities be. But the red light is on for who should do it, because the public will say it's industry's fault. Industry will say, well, maybe the regulators should do something about it. Regardless of where we sit, we're looking at somebody else to make the changes. And so that's our biggest challenge is who should do it, who should take these steps. And we believe there's a role for everyone on a local, a regional, a national, and an international scale. So scientists and regulators, policymakers need to work together to get that information out, to make sure that we know what those early warning signs are, and to keep us below those tipping points. And all of us in society and as individuals need to commit to action. So we end our talk basically by reiterating that we sincerely believe you are the right person in the right time at the right place to make a difference towards land sustainability. So we thank the AIA for the opportunity to work on this. Vic and I would never have worked on a project like this together, and it really was an interesting experience. We both felt we learned a lot, and it was really interesting to try to put together the kinds of things that we wanted to leave you with. So thank you for that, and thanks to all of you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you.